Hey everyone, welcome to Lesson 5-9, Government and Politics in the Civil War. So, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War impacted American ideals over the course of the war. How did Lincoln's leadership change the country? So let's start here. If we go back to Lincoln's first inaugural address, you remember that Lincoln said that this was a war to preserve the Union. He gave assurances to the South that he was not going to intervene with slavery where it was. He just would not allow it to extend into existing territory, which is exactly what the Free Soil movement wanted. But Lincoln said preservation of the Union is our goal. And so he took a very conservative approach to winning the war. When Lincoln became president, he wasn't trying to abolish slavery. We have to make that clear. And that's what I mean by conservative here. It's just preventing its extension, but tolerating it where it was. And Lincoln had constitutional doubts. He said, legally slaves are property. As president, I don't have the constitutional power to just take away people's property. So he felt that he could not do anything to abolish slavery. Regardless of his personal views, which was slavery was wrong, constitutionally, he had no ability to do so. The other problem Lincoln had was the border states. That's Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. And these were states that remained in the Union, but they had legal slavery. So a lot of their sympathies were to the South, but they never went into secession. And Lincoln had to, as he was planning strategy, had to keep very much in mind that he had states where slavery was still legal, and he needed those states to not leave the Union and have a third wave of secession. So let's take a look at what I call Lincoln's border state problem. And that is that pro-Confederate feelings were rising in a number of the border states. Missouri and Kentucky both have violent uprisings, both actually elect separate governments that vote for secession. Missouri has 2 governors at one point. Western Kentucky creates its own government. In Maryland, though, was Lincoln's big problem because D.C. sits squarely between Virginia, which is already Confederate, and Maryland. The District of Columbia is right in the midst of those 2 states. And if Maryland was successful in seceding, which the majority of its population wanted to, including the governor, the mayor of Baltimore, the legislature, that meant the national capital would be in the Confederacy, and Congress and the president and everybody would have to flee or they'd be captured by the South. So Lincoln was particularly concerned about keeping Maryland in the Union against his will. So he does a couple unprecedented things as president of the United States. One, he introduces martial law, which means that he replaces the elected governments of those states, with the military, and generals go in and take over. That they begin to make policies, institute curfews, legislatures don't meet, governors and mayors don't have executive authority. The military, who answers to the president, is in charge in Maryland. He also suspends the right of habeas corpus, and that's a constitutional right that says that if you're accused of a crime, you have to be charged with that crime, and you have the right to get an attorney to try to show that you did not do what you're accused of. So Lincoln suspends that right, which meant that anybody the military arrested in those states sat in jail indefinitely. No access to an attorney, no right to be in front of a judge, no trial. You were in prison for the duration of the war. So those are things American presidents have never done before, but Lincoln said in the wartime situation, those were constitutional uses of his power. So let's talk about Lincoln and emancipation. Emancipation is where the government will free the slaves, and it provides legal freedom for enslaved people. And as we said early on, Lincoln did not call for emancipation. But by 1863, because the war isn't going so well, he needs to address the issue of emancipation for enslaved people in the U.S. And for a number of different reasons, the emancipation is now at the forefront of Lincoln's thinking. One, his generals are telling him strategy wise, the South is being supported by slave labor. They're using the food, what little food there was grown by slaves. They are in some cases arming slaves. They're using slaves to move supplies. And that is keeping the Southern military going. So if we eliminate the slaves, it's going to hurt the military strategy of the South. Two, that should say fading morale. Among Union soldiers, some of whom only signed up for 90 days, they're fighting to preserve the Union, but that's not an idea when bullets are whizzing by your head that makes much sense. Soldiers really didn't know what they were fighting for. You know, a lot of them had the feeling if the South wants to go, let them go. And so their desire to be there, their desire to fight, which is what morale is, plummets. And then that weakens the Northern military because your soldiers are more like, nah, about what they're doing. So Lincoln needs to find something inspirational for the soldiers. Three, abolitionist leaders are really putting pressure on him to take advantage of this opportunity, and now is the moment to abolish slavery in the country. Frederick Douglass especially was pressuring Lincoln, and again saying, if you free the slaves, they'll fight against the South, and nobody's going to fight harder than someone who was an enslaved person. Fourth is probably the biggest reason, and that is British involvement. The British have previously abolished slavery in the British Empire a couple of years prior to this. But the South was continually trying to attract them to their side in the war. And so Secretary of State William Seward advises the president, if you get rid of slavery in the United States, Britain will remain neutral. They're not going to get involved in a war on a side that wants to continue to have slavery. So Lincoln, if he wanted to keep a major power from siding with the Confederacy, he could do that by abolishing slavery. And finally, within Congress, some of his political rivals in the Republican Party were preparing legislation to do what Lincoln wouldn't do. And he was afraid that if the move to abolish slavery came from the legislature, it would weaken his power as the president. And in wartime, he could not tolerate that. So it was a matter of striking before they do. Now, Seward does tell Lincoln, you have to wait, because he said, dude, we're not doing well in the war, and you keep swapping out the generals and we keep losing. He said, if you just out of nowhere announce the emancipation of enslaved people, it's going to look like we're desperate, and morale is going to further plummet in the military. We have to do it attached to a reason, so that we're doing it on a moral crusade. And Lincoln has that reason after the Battle of Antietam. It was a battle that took place in Maryland, and the North beat the South. It was really their first big victory. It occurred before Gettysburg. And after the Battle of Antietam, where they won a big win, Lincoln said, now is the time. And he went into his desk and he pulled out the Emancipation Proclamation, which had been sitting there for months. It was already written and ready to go. Lincoln was just sitting on it, waiting for this needed win. Now, to get around his constitutional qualms about emancipation, Lincoln said, I'm going to do this as commander-in-chief. And this is how I'm able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. First of all, it's a military order. If you read it, it's a very dull document written in military language. He did not make a big, profound speech from a balcony somewhere. This was an order to the generals. And what it said was that slaves were contraband, which is material that is used to aid the enemy. So he ordered his military leaders to seize and free the slaves to deprive the enemy of a wartime resource. That was how he was able to abolish slavery, using his military powers. The application of the order, however, was only good wherever the U.S. military was in the South, because Lincoln restricted the wording of the Emancipation only to territories in open insurrection. So if a state had not seceded, the border states, then it was not in place and the military did not enforce it. It also meant in the South, if the U.S. Army wasn't somewhere, let's say like southern Louisiana, the order had no effect whatsoever. And enforcement could only be done by the U.S. military. So let's talk about the consequences of this. As we mentioned, it was very limited in scope. In the border states, like places like Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, West Virginia, slavery was not abolished and it continued on. Lincoln could not abolish it there because those areas were not an open insurrection. And that helped him keep those states on the side of the Union. Another thing was that most slaves freed themselves. It's called emancipation by foot. They simply walked off the plantations or just left before U.S. soldiers even got there. A lot of times rumors would spread the U.S. military was somewhere in the area and the slaves would go to find them. So while the military did emancipate some slaves under the Emancipation Proclamation, the vast majority of black people just said the heck with this and they just walked off of the plantation and there was no one really there to stop them. It wasn't until Congress passed and the northern states ratified the 13th Amendment that slavery was formally abolished in the United States. And the 13th is a constitutional amendment to prohibit slavery anywhere in the country. That fills in all the gaps that Lincoln's wartime order was not going to cover. The problem, again, is enforcement. So Lee surrendered to Grant in April of 1865. That's when the Appomattox Courthouse was. However, in the western part of the Confederacy, in Texas, the fighting continued until June 19th, 1866, almost over a full year later, that the Civil War was still going in Texas. So when the Confederate forces surrendered there, that is where the Union soldiers finally abolished the last slavery in the United States. And that marks the celebration of Juneteenth, or June 19th, where the last pocket of slavery was finally ended in the country when U.S. troops under the Emancipation Proclamation enforced the 13th Amendment. The big question was, what do we do with these black people now? Now they're no longer slaves. Are they residents like the Mexicans? Are they citizens? What should we do? And a lot of Northerners did not want black people to have citizenship because that meant they could vote, they could serve on juries, they could file lawsuits. There was strong opposition to citizenship. But at the very end of the war, Lincoln made a speech in which he endorsed citizenship for the black people of the United States. He said, let's throw out the Dred Scott decision and make every black person a citizen, and I support that. In the crowd was John Wilkes Booth, who was a Confederate agent operating in Washington, D.C., and a very well-known actor. When Booth heard that, his initial plan was to kidnap Lincoln, take him into the South, and hold him for ransom to end the war. The plan changes when citizenship is put on the table. So Booth, along with his fellow conspirators, planned to kill not only Lincoln, but Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State Seward as well. They want to completely destabilize the Northern government. Booth's plot is only partially successful. He does kill Lincoln in Ford's Theater and then escapes into Virginia, where he's captured and killed later by U.S. soldiers. Johnson, they couldn't find, so he escaped any harm. And Seward, they tried to kill him and they were unsuccessful. He was stabbed by an attacker, but not fatally. But now Lincoln is dead and the North is leaderless. And that is a dangerous proposition for both the North and the South, keeping in mind that Lincoln promised with malice towards none. Okay, so let's talk about the two addresses that Lincoln did that are important. The Gettysburg Address. Lincoln gave that after the Battle of Gettysburg, and it was a speech in which he turned the battlefield into a cemetery because there were so many dead people there. And in that speech, Lincoln said that there was a new birth of freedom in the country. And this was the moral cause. He said, after Gettysburg, this is a fight to end slavery, and this is a fight to recognize that the Declaration means all people created equal, includes Black people. So Lincoln redefined who freedom was and what equality was in the Gettysburg Address. In Lincoln's second inaugural address, when he won re-election, he came out much stronger. He was much more emboldened than he was in the first inaugural, where he won a squeaker of an election. And in the second inaugural, Lincoln declared that slavery was a national sin and that God was punishing both the Union and the Confederacy and the people of the United States for allowing that sin to occur in their country. And he said, war is the price they pay for slavery. So he invoked a religious reason to justify the Civil War and say that this is our penance, this is our sin that we have to atone for. And then he ends the speech with the phrase, with malice towards none and charity towards all, which is his way of saying we don't want to punish the South. We want to bring them back into the Union quickly with forgiveness so that we don't punish them to a degree that the war continues or it bubbles up again later. We have to do this as countrymen, and we have to do this together. That statement will prove problematic after Lincoln is dead, and we'll see that coming up. So remember, we're looking to see how Lincoln's leadership changed the Civil War and changed the course of the war. And some of those vital speeches are essential to that. If you have questions, feel free to email or ask your teacher. And as always, have a great day.